Welcome to the Low Production, High Value Show with your host, Andrew Jenkins. On the show, we'll be exploring the world of entrepreneurship, social media, and the growing digital landscape. Whether you're a seasoned entrepreneur or just starting out, you know that the world of business is constantly evolving and changing. And in today's digital age, it is more important than ever to understand how social media and technology are affecting the way we do business. That's why on this show, we'll be talking to entrepreneurs and experts who have a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with you. From the latest trends and technologies to the struggles and triumphs of running a business, we'll be covering it all. So if you're looking to level up your entrepreneurial game and become more digitally savvy, then let's get started with the Low Production, High Value Show.
So today's guest is Roland Harwood, author of On the Edge. Welcome, Roland. Great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So to kick things off, I wanted to ask you one, to position the book on what it's about thematically and what inspired you to write it.
Sure. So the book is about making sense of our increasingly connected world. That's the subtitle. And the kind of three main themes are really around reframing uncertainty as an opportunity rather than a threat. It's about engineering serendipity by connecting people and ideas. And it's also about navigating transitions, both personally and professionally, which is a topic that kind of fascinates me. And what prompted me to write it was really, a lifetime's worth of thinking and working on some of these topics, but in particular in the last 4 or 5 years, with of course the pandemic right in the middle of that time, going through pretty major transition in my own life and professional working life, but also during that time hosting a podcast as well, where I've interviewed about 50 people. And so the book is really a kind of synthesis of what I've learned over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, largely through many of those podcast conversations around some of those themes. And I think, in a nutshell, I think we're all in different aspects of our life and work, sort of in transition, facing uncertainty, needing to engineer a little bit of luck or serendipity for ourselves almost all of the time. And I don't think there's too much guidance or wisdom to help us, to help me, to help others. So I thought I would try and produce a little book around some of those topics. So yeah, that's the background.
With the people that you had those conversations with, did you find a lot of kindred spirits, or were a lot of them someone to you, I'll call it seeking versus having answers?
I guess I'm drawn to people who are seeking, but I'm also drawn to people who seem to have figured some stuff out in some way that I can learn from, and hopefully others who are listening to those conversations afterwards can learn from as well. So I would say it's a little bit of both, but I'm very drawn to people who are just trying to ask better questions, trying to make sense of our increasingly connected world, as the subtitle. And so yeah, it was a little bit of both.
Did you find that they were asking you? I mean, I know you might have reached out to them proactively to have a conversation with them, but in the course of those conversations, did you find that they were also kind of prodding you with questions to force you to consider things you may not have, or morph your perspective in any way?
Oh, for sure, massively. I mean, even if nobody listened to the podcast, it would be huge.
It served you well.
It served me well to learn. And some conversations, definitely, people were asking me. It was very much a sort of dialogue. In other conversations, it was more me interviewing them. I definitely feel more comfortable asking the questions rather than answering them. So the shoe is on the other foot today, Andrew. So go gently with me. I'm sure you will. But it was definitely a bit of back and forth. But yeah, it was more about teasing out their wisdom. But I can't help myself. I like to share my own stories and my own experiences as well in response to what I heard.
But I'm sure it's safe to say that you're not finished. Like there's still seeking to be done, questions to be answered.
Oh yeah, an infinite number. I mean, I'm done with writing the book for now, and I've sort of paused the podcast, and we'll see if I continue that. I'm not sure. We might come onto it, but I'm sort of building a new venture, and that's consuming most of my energies. Yeah, there's always an infinite number of interesting people to talk to and questions to think about.
Well, without prying too much, is the new venture sort of, building upon the journey that you've had especially over the last 4 or 5 years in those conversations? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything's connected, right? But it's with a specific focus around sort of climate innovation and building an ecosystem of innovators around kind of climate innovation. So it's facing the uncertainty and the sometimes kind of hopeless narrative that we're faced with in the media, especially around the climate and our future and our children's future. It's around trying to connect people and ideas and technologies to come up with new solutions. It's about navigating that transition to a more sustainable future. So it's hopefully a more focused and tangible and practical application of some of the ideas that we explore in the book.
and infused a little bit of hope as well.
Huge amount of hope. I don't know if you know Rebecca Solnit, but she talks about hope impels us to act. And she, I didn't interview her in the podcast, even though I did actually reach out to her. But she's had quite a big impact on me. And the distinction between hope and optimism. Are you familiar with this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, just very quickly for those that aren't, perhaps. Right. I always, until a few years ago, would describe myself as a sort of pragmatic optimist. So trying to see the positive, try and be practical with it as well. But through reading some of Rebecca Solnit's work, she sort of explains how optimism is passive, whereas hope is active. So if you're optimistic about the future, you think, oh, well, everything's going to be fine. So, I don't necessarily have to do anything about it. Whereas hope about the future impels us to do something about that hope and realize that hopefully more positive future. And so I think when it comes to climate, far too many people, myself included, have been far too passive for far too long. And so I think we need narratives and a strategy that is far more hopeful rather than either merely optimistic or pessimistic, which is also very passive in the opposite direction.
Well, to build on that, and we were talking about it before I pressed record, that quote from W.H. Murray about, when you, and I'm paraphrasing here, when you state publicly your intention, then comes providence. And that was a quote that Bob Geldof, founder of Band-Aid, shared years ago when he did a keynote for Nesta, which you were affiliated with at the time. That when he was asked how did he mobilize people for the cause of Band-Aid, it was by just saying, this is what I'm trying to do, and people rose up to help. So when you talk about optimism versus hope with this new initiative, are people raising their hand to say, wanting to be involved or wanting to help by the mere fact that you've stated, this is my intention?
Yes, I mean, first of all, you shared that quote with me before this conversation, and I really, really like it, and people should check it out, the full verbatim version. It's quite long, but it's very good. And actually, you referenced Bob Geldof talking about that at this event at Nesta years ago, and I was actually in the room, and I remember that talk vividly. What's that expression? People don't remember what you said, but how it made you feel. I remember it making me feel hopeful and inspired, though I didn't remember that specific quote that you just mentioned.
It had the same effect on me, which is why I still remember it to this day, and I've shared it with others when they express some whatever reason, like where they seem to their hope is waning, or they seem to be at a juncture where they're unclear of. Or as you talk about in the book, they're at a point of uncertainty. So,
well, I think to your question, whether people are, I wouldn't compare myself and what I'm doing to Bob Geldof and Band-Aid, which is obviously a remarkable achievement. But in my own way, I'm asking for help. I certainly don't have all the answers. But I think I see an opportunity and a need, and I'm talking about it more and more publicly through publishing this book, through some other work we're doing, which I can share a bit more about if you like. But and lots of people are saying, hey, we want to be involved in what you're doing. That sounds great. Getting a lot of that kind of feedback. Some people are saying, I can help you in this way. Would you like me to do that? To which the answer is always yes, because we're limited in time and resources.
Right.
And so it's a bit of a journey. And I think something I've had to learn is asking for help more. And I find that difficult. Maybe there's pride, maybe there's ego, maybe there's a variety of reasons why I don't ask for help as much as I could and I should. So I'm getting better at it. Still have some work to do on that front.
Well, that leads me to a question. So, in full transparency for those listening and watching, so you had me conduct a research project years ago through Nesta on all of the predominant social networks at that time. And during that research, and at the time, I think at the time as well, Malcolm Gladwell's book Tipping Point was out, and it both my research and the book made reference to a study by, I think it's either Gronevetter, and this concept of the strength of weak ties. And the reason I bring that up, or to set the context with that, is this idea, as people are, as you said, you're sometimes reluctant to ask for help. I'm wondering if you have found in the work that you did at Nesta or 100% Open or since then, that you have found help from people that have been a weaker tie versus someone who's been a friend or a core network member for years. I'm wondering if you've seen proof of that concept of that you'll get more help or support from a weaker tie than you would from someone who's a deep connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, anecdotally, I see that all the time, but there's a lot of data and evidence and research to back this up. So if people aren't familiar with this kind of weak ties, strong ties framing, it's been around since the 1970s or something like that. But it's basically the idea that the average human being can only maintain about 150 strong relationships and friendships, after which point, for every new relationship you add into your life, you kind of another one falls off the other end, if that makes sense. And that's an average, 150. That's Robin Dunbar's work. But most people, and enhanced through social media, can maintain weak connections to thousands of people, potentially tens of thousands or more. And there's a lot of really fascinating research and evidence, and I've seen this again and again myself as well, that real innovation and comes often from your weak ties rather than your strong ties. Your strong relationships, we recycle information amongst our core peer group, and often it's the same sort of information going through multiple iterations and loops, and those strong ties and relationships are really, really important for all sorts of reasons. But actually, when it comes to new ideas and new breakthroughs and new innovations, it's your weak ties, people you in some cases forgot you were even connected to. And I've had a flurry of that, actually, having just written this book, because I've done some promotion around it. I've self-published it, and so I've been promoting it on social media, and a whole bunch of people, some of whom I won't name names, I'd completely forgotten about, had seen the book, chosen to read the book, and have gotten back in touch. I was having a conversation with someone just this morning that falls into that category, and it's a lovely thing just to be reminded, and people to be inspired to pick up the phone or get back in touch. But actually, that one of the people I interviewed for the book, in fact, she's on the front cover, Tessie Britton. She's the founder of an amazing organisation called the Participatory Cities Foundation, which is based here, started in London, has now moved to Scotland and Canada, Halifax in Canada and East Kilbride in Scotland. And it's about a much more participatory way of building, bridging social capital, to use some jargon, but to bring together diverse communities in a place to improve the economic, social, and health outcomes in a particular place. And so there's some good data and science behind it, but it's also a very human and humane program. And she said to me when I interviewed her for one of the early episodes of my podcast that made it into the book, it's that your weak ties can often have the most impact on you and your life. And funnily enough, she got in touch with me about 4 years ago, just at the time I was setting up Liminal and starting to think about this book. And she and I had lost touch with each other, but she invited me to be on the board of her organisation, Participatory Cities Foundation, and that in many ways has my involvement in that organisation has kind of shaped what I've gone on to do significantly since then. So yeah, absolutely anecdotally, my weak ties are absolutely essential to everything that I do, and this is what's wonderful about that initial work that we did together, where I think the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is, are social networks the new cities? Was a phrase I'd heard somebody else use. I can't remember now who it was, and I tasked you with answering the question, are they, yes or no, which of course is far too binary a question, but
well, the answer was it depends. The answer that everyone hates, or the consulting speak, and but it to your point, there were aspects of them that I'll call it had weak ties, that had, I'll call it, the citizenry of certain social networks, but then it also had anonymity and a variety of other things. So it was a real treat to explore. And it has even recent conversations around the metaverse. I people have asked me my take on it, and I jump back to the research work and saying there was a time when Linden Labs and Second Life, although it's still around, I said the thing about Second Life was I could join it, and I could be, if I wanted to be a 3-foot tall dragon that wanted to, wear a spacesuit, I could do that. But also I could hide who I was. And that anonymity and the impediment to being trustworthy, because I was anonymous, I think hindered its growth.
Yeah.
When Facebook came around and I had to have a .edu email and I had to put my headshot and so on, there was implied trust, and it exploded in growth. And so if the metaverse could marry that, the need for trust and identity, but then gave me the freedom to explore these new worlds and the magic of virtual worlds where I can fly and I can move from different places, there might be something. The hurdle still remained in the case for the metaverse was technology. I had to buy a headset and all this equipment, and the hurdles to overcome. Maybe someday, but it's still the fundamental still came back to what came about from the research, which was trust, and the risks of that. Not well. You look now at Twitter and the blue check mark. Now it's up for grabs, and people can pose as others and so on. So.
I saw an amusing commentary on that Twitter blue check mark, on Twitter, of course, the other day. You might have seen it, making the comparison with the Dr. Seuss book, The Sneetches, with the stars upon theirs. I don't know if you know that, but that's where...
No, that's a obscure Seuss book for me. I don't know that one.
Well, okay, check it out. It's quite amusing. It's quite accurate to, I think, what's happening with Twitter verification, but... I think the point around trust is well made, of course, especially online. That's harder to emulate and replicate. I think there is something about the joy of the anonymity of joining a community like Second Life, where you can embody an entirely new body or identity and play with that. There is something about moving to a new place or a new city that allows one to play with a new identity as well, and experiment a little bit, and there's something about the anonymity of often bigger cities, but it can be anywhere really, which is harder to do in a smaller community where everyone knows everyone. So I think there's a time and a place for anonymity and reinvention, and then there's a time and a place for embedding deep, solid, trusted relationships. And of course, as with all things in life, it's a balance between the two.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Social media has become an imperative for almost every business. Discover how to successfully implement an effective social media strategy that is supported and integrated throughout every part of your organization with this essential book from our host, Andrew Jenkins, Social Media Marketing for Business, Scaling an Integrated Social Media Strategy Across Your Organization, is now available from Amazon or KoganPage.com.
I want to jump back to when you were talking about Tessie and the her organization, and just given how much innovation has been a part of your work, using weak ties, and not only weak ties, but not constraining them from the standpoint of putting them all in the room and saying brainstorm, but to use these weak ties in potentially a distributed network where they can't collaborate in the same room. How does that, in your experience, how does that foster innovation and idea development?
So sorry, is the question how does innovation occur for me through my second degree connections in my network?
Yeah, well, so if we, to start over, so if we look at the strength of weak ties, and you present a dilemma to this distributed community of people that are loosely connected, does that have a greater likelihood of bringing about innovative ideas than taking that same, or maybe not taking the same group of people, but taking a group of people that know one another well and putting them in a room and tasked with the same question?
Well, for sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the one thing that springs to mind is if you put out, so I've just been doing this earlier this afternoon, my time, actually sharing with about 25 people that I trust, in a nutshell, an outline of this new business that we're building, or proposition that we're building. And it's kind of the first time I presented this to this group, and had some great feedback and really helpful contributions. And it was a Zoom call, but it was a sort of trusted, closed group. Conversely, you can put stuff out on the internet, on Twitter, on Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever, and see what comes back. I think there's something really powerful about sort of triangulating trends. So just as a rule of thumb, and I talk about this at one point in the book, I tend to ignore recommendations for films or books or articles until I've heard 2 or 3 people recommend them independently of each other. So when I'm reasonably confident it's not just one recommendation that's been passed to another, but it's like 2 or 3 independent recommendations. And then I start to pay attention. It's like, well, if Andrew likes it, and if Tessie likes it, and if somebody else likes it, then there's got to be something to that. Mainly because there's a finite amount of time in the world, and I don't have time to watch all the movies and read all the books that everyone might happen to mention over the course of a day. But if 2 or 3 or multiple people are independently mentioning it, then sort of to make a note. So to use my network, those network effects, to sort of filter out the signal from the noise in that regard. Having said that, I've seen through running and designing and running innovation communities in the past that often when you create some kind of voting mechanism around ideas, for instance, that the ideas that get the most votes are usually the most obvious ideas, not necessarily the best ideas. So the most easy to understand. And sometimes they are the best ideas, and that's just what you should do, especially if it hasn't been done before. Keep it simple. But sometimes there'll be a quirky little thing that most people don't really get or understand that might only attract 1 or 2 votes. So it's helpful to have a mechanism where you can sort of ask the crowd, of these 10 ideas, which is your favorite to least favorite, or however you go about doing that voting. But not to use that as a hard filter, but just a steer. And often the best ideas come from the edges, which is part of inspiration behind the name of the book, On the Edge. I think the most interesting ideas and opportunities happen at the fringes of organizations or places, or of our consciousness, for that matter. So I think there's fertile ground to be spent at the edges of places and organizations to foster new ideas and inspiration and innovation.
Then do people need to, so going back to what you were saying earlier about optimism and hope, so I'm in a group, even distributed remotely, and we all come up with a bunch of different ideas, but myself or another member of the group comes up with I'll call it an outlier. An outlier idea, to your point, isn't going to be necessarily everyone's favorite, but shouldn't be dismissed out of hand or disregarded. Perhaps it gets filed away for the future, but as you identified, there's something about it. And if you go around the group and saying, like, what are your favorites, is to give people permission to, there may be others that like it too, but maybe it's not the majority. And so it's trying to avoid the risk of the wisdom of crowds that could potentially drown out some of these, neat, unique, but less supported ideas. And so the reason I bring that up is this idea of the hope. If I was the originator of the idea, do I hold on to it out of hope? Try to champion it. I don't know if you've seen that in your workshops. Anyone?
I have for sure. I think people become myself included, become very attached to their ideas very, very quickly. And I think if you want to be truly innovative in an organization or in a workshop, you need to find a way to equalize the participation and sort of take out the ego a little bit from the process. So it's not Andrew's idea is better than Roland's idea. It's like Andrew and Roland had a conversation and came up with something that is better than either of us could have thought of on our own. And so we're both have shaped it and influenced it, and therefore more likely to kind of get involved. And that only magnifies the more people, you get involved in that conversation. So this is where online tools and the huge global experiment that we've all been through with the pandemic has actually highlighted some of the benefits, I think, of if you really want to harness kind of collective intelligence of a group, the number one kind of driver of that is combining diverse perspectives. And often what happens in a group, especially in a room, but also in a virtual room, is that 20% of the people do 80% of the talking, that kind of Pareto principle that, the dominant, most senior person or the most outgoing person or whoever it might be tends to, kick off the conversation and probably dominate the conversation if it's not, if there's not some strong kind of cultural norms that encourage everybody to participate a bit more equally, or perhaps there's a facilitator that's trying to make sure that happens a bit more equitably. Whereas, with Miro or, any of these kind of tools that we've all grown up, especially in the last few years using, you can hear from 100 people all at the same time, sharing ideas, sharing post-it notes independently in response to a question first, and then the job is to discuss and synthesize. And usually what happens in my experience there is there's some stuff that is just a kind of low-hanging fruit, no-brainer, and everyone likes, and there's some stuff that is kind of quite easy to dismiss for whatever reason. It's not very well thought through or just not appropriate. But there's this kind of really interesting fuzzy middle ground, a kind of liminal space in the middle. Liminal being the name of the community that I founded 4 years ago, and is the publisher of my book as well. There's this kind of grey area in the middle where things could be an amazing idea, they're just not kind of polished yet, or there could be an amazing opportunity, but it's just not understood by enough people yet. So that's where I think you kind of want to bank the low-hanging fruit. You want to get rid of the kind of, the things that are not fit for purpose, and then you want to really spend some time in this liminal space on the edges and exploring, because if nothing else, I've learned that there's no idea, no matter how good and no matter how creative or innovative an individual or an organization is, that doesn't benefit from socialization, iteration, and combination. So by spending time connecting people and ideas, that will create new and better ideas as well as a result.
They talk about innovation coming from constraints, but I'm wondering, when you talk about being in a liminal state, be it as a person or as an organization that perhaps needs or wants to innovate, is being in a liminal state an aspect of being in a state of uncertainty, perhaps anxiety, versus just there are some constraints weighing on you or weighing on the organization? Sometimes I wonder about, like, I think of the quote from Hunt for Red October: when Cortez reached the New World, he burned all of his ships and his men were well motivated. This idea of the burning platform, or the, there's some trying to instill some urgency amongst colleagues to bring about innovation. Perhaps maybe urgency is too much pressure. The reason I bring all that up is this: I'm wondering about, in the state of being in a liminal state, whether uncertainty and anxiety versus or urgency plays a role there, or you can be in a state of being in a liminal state, but not necessarily anxious, but just open to new things.
Well, I think there's definitely. Perhaps worth just explaining what a liminal state is for those that don't know, just briefly. So the term liminality comes from anthropology. Anthropologists studying rites of passages in different societies and communities, and probably one of the best examples would be something like a bar mitzvah in Jewish culture, where you say goodbye to your boyhood and you're not yet a man. It's the ceremony that kind of bridges that divide, that gap. I've forgotten what that's called in Mexican culture. What's it called?
Chiquitera?
Quinceanera or something like that.
Quinceanera,
yeah, something like that. Anyway, so it's the same sort of ceremony, albeit different religious and cultural background. But so what's kind of fascinating to me about things like that is you're just to go back to the bar mitzvah, for example, you're no longer a boy, but you're not yet a man, and you're sort of both and neither simultaneously. And within that lies huge opportunity for reinvention, a little bit like our conversation around moving into Second Life or moving to a new city for the first time. You have that opportunity to reinvent yourself in a new and different way. And that can be really scary. Absolutely, it can. And I run away from uncertainty as much as the next person, and I struggle with this on a daily basis. But there was somebody I interviewed through my podcast about 2 years ago called Margaret Heffernan. I don't know if you're familiar with her. I think she's Canadian, actually, but she now lives in the UK.
I know her name, and I think I follow her on Twitter, or did.
Yeah, she's given TED Talks and written lots of books, and she's a fascinating woman. And if you've got time, I can't remember the name of the episode of the podcast, but I'll share it with you afterwards if people want to listen.
Okay.
But she played this little thought experiment, or she shared this little thought experiment with me in my conversation with her, saying, who would want to know, like, the day that you're going to die, and how would you live your life differently if you did, know that information? And
that's a heavy question.
It's a heavy question, but the conclusion she draws, and I agree with this, is like most people wouldn't want to know that. Even having the certainty of that would be, you would live your life very differently. It would be like waiting for the bus to come, she said. It would be very boring and sad, really. And likewise, who wants to know what they're going to get for their birthday present? Almost nobody. And it's within the uncertainty of how long we have left on this planet, or what we're getting for our birthday, or what the future may hold for us personally and professionally. Within that uncertainty lies opportunity and even joy on occasion. Of course, fear and anxiety as well. So it's not either or, it's both. And so she really helped me kind of rethink and reframe uncertainty as something to be minimized and feared and run away from, to something to be approached with a slightly more kind of Zen mindset, that there can be dangers lurking, for sure, on the edge of a cliff, but there can also be, wonderful opportunities if you have the courage to dive into the lake, to continue that metaphor slightly, and swim to the other side and discover new worlds or what have you. I think there is, and that reminds me of some research, some psychology research that shows that the physiological effect of anxiety and excitement are almost identical. It's very hard physiologically to tell the two apart, anxiety and excitement. So rather than trying to suppress anxiety when you feel it, which is very, very hard to do, as we all know, but to sort of try and self-talk your way out of anxiety into excitement is easier than trying to sort of suppress anxiety. And that's still not an easy thing to do. Something I'm grappling with right now with some of the stuff I'm facing and doing, which is quite uncertain. And that does give me some cause for anxiety for sure. But I'm also very excited about it, and I'm trying to marry the balance between those two. So I think, as with all things, as we said at the beginning in relation to other matters, it's a balance between the two. And Margaret Heffernan describes it far more articulately than I just have, if anyone's interested to explore that a bit deeper.
Well, and I want to touch on something you referenced earlier about uncertainty, but I look at it slightly different, more about as you said, I'm uncertain of what might happen, but lots of possibility if I try to reframe my shift from anxiety to excitement. In the book you talk about serendipity, and I think, not to get all Oprah on you, but people have talked to Oprah about, and others, and I listened to the How I Built This podcast, and Guy Raz always ends it with, how much of your success was luck versus effort. And the reason I bring up Oprah is she talked about, it's not necessarily luck, it's potentially serendipity, but being prepared to act when serendipity presents itself.
Yeah.
And I'm paraphrasing again, but I'm wondering, in your own journey, and the people you've been connected with, introduced to, etc., has it been luck? Has it been serendipity with preparedness? What's your how would you describe your experience?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. I've just got back from a holiday with family, where I went to see the graves of both of one of my grandfathers who died in the war, and another grandfather who also died on the other side of the war, and the ripple effects that those deaths had of people in my family who I never knew. I had no personal relationship with them directly, but has had through the generations still now. So there's all these kind of big macro factors that affect our lives that we have no direct influence over it whatsoever. And so luck obviously plays a huge part in any of our success, for sure. But as per that formula, luck or effort, I would add in two other elements to that. So I think my success, other people's success is definitely down to luck. It's definitely down to hard work. I think it's also down to courage, and it's also down to triangulation. This point I made earlier, and that's maybe not the snappiest of formulas, but I've been fortunate to be able to set up a couple of companies, and I remember really vividly with my first company in particular, and not everybody has the perhaps the security in their life to be able to take the risk to set up their own company, and so I'm lucky in that regard that I've been able to do that. But it took me a long time until I was 35 when I set up my first company, and I'd spent most of my adult working life wanting to, but not quite plucking up the courage until I was 35 years old. And it wasn't until I did that, as per the quote you mentioned earlier, that not the Bob Geldof quote, but the W.H. Murray quote. It's not until I had sort of decided to set up that company and sort of told the world about it that all of a sudden people slightly crawled out of the woodwork saying, "Oh, hey, maybe you can help us with this," or how about we have a chat and see if there might be an opportunity to collaborate. And these were in many cases people I'd known for quite a few years, But it wasn't until I'd had the courage to sort of go public and take the leap into the unknown and start that new company that people would offer to help, as per the the Bob Geldof analogy earlier with Band-Aid, or invite me to have a conversation about something different. So I think there's definitely some bravery required when it comes to success, and I wouldn't say I'm a particularly brave individual. I'm probably average. I don't think I'm exceptional in that regard, but I have a certain degree of courage to try new things. And then this kind of triangulation piece as well, which is kind of trying to use your networks combined with your gut instinct and whatever tools and data that you have at your disposal to try and sift out the opportunities from the areas that might be a bit of a waste of time. So luck has definitely played a huge role. I'm also a bit of a grafter. I'm quite persistent. People will tell you I send lots of chase emails or what have you until people respond, and I think others might give up sooner than I do. So that's definitely part of it. A little bit of courage and a lot of triangulation. So that's how I would describe it.
They say amongst the the pure sales that most salespeople give up after 3 or 4 attempts, but a lot of sales happen after the 12th to 18th attempt.
Okay.
So stick with it.
Yeah.
But you're at another point of transition,
Yeah.
to use your bar mitzvah example.
Yeah.
Again, referencing the research that I did years ago, there was a phrase that came up in the research which led to actually me connecting with someone who had graduated with a master's in economics from a university in France, who ended up at the World Bank, who I got to meet and go to an event there, all because of the research project.
Okay.
But anyway, in the research, there was a phrase that was used referring to the transition from communist Russia to capitalist Russia. And it was a phrase about how networks were important. And the phrase was that people were giving favors of access to their network by people who needed access to their network to aid the transition, things that needed to be communicated, things that needed to be shared, etc. And I remember sitting down at a user event when LinkedIn was just coming to Canada, and the head of LinkedIn Canada was there, and I shared that phrase with him. He wrote it down. He was so intrigued by that. And the reason, again, a long setup here, that concept of favors of access to not, and it's kind of paying it forward. It isn't necessarily about networking with an agenda. It strikes me that that's been a long-standing philosophy of yours, and I'm wondering, just as we come to a close, when you think about the transition you're at now, and you've been a prolific connector, how that will play a role that you see going forward in this, in the years ahead for you in this new transition.
Yeah, I have several thoughts in relation to what you just said there. I mean, first of all, the transition from communist to capitalist Russia fascinates me. It's not something I've known too much about. I've been reading some books and watching some documentaries on that, just in light of what's been happening in Ukraine and stuff in the last couple of years, and trying to educate myself in some of that. Because in my own family history, my mother grew up in East Germany and escaped to the West, and I have a whole story, one of which I sort of tell at the beginning of the book, which is in 1988, so a year before the wall came down in Berlin, which was then a divided city because of the Cold War. So around that similar time, the transition from communism to capitalism in Russia as well. I was actually living as a teenager, as a 14-year-old in West Berlin at the time, and we moved back to the UK, which is where I live now, in late 1988. And we'd been to visit some of my mum's old school friends in East Germany during that time, and I was just starting to become curious about the world and politics, and why is it that there's a wall surrounding this city, that you can't travel more than 20 minutes before you reach a border crossing. Anyway, we went to visit old friends and family of my mother's in East Germany who'd stayed in East Germany and lived under the communist regime. And in 1988, less than a year before the wall came down, they were all adamant when I asked them that the regime would not change within their lifetimes, that the wall coming down was sort of impossible. And yet less than 12 months later, the wall had come down. And as I said, I quote in the book, Nelson Mandela, in relation to apartheid, said a few years after that, it always appears impossible until it's done. And that experience living in West Germany just before the wall came down made a profound impact on me at the time. And I think there's a lot of stuff that seems impossible in relation to climate change, in relation to the way we responded to the COVID pandemic, in relation to lots of things which seem impossible until we're in it. Anyway, that I just thought I'd share that because it was a little story from the book, but I think it's relevant to what you said there. But to your point around access, I think absolutely you want to be the person that people get in touch with when they need help with, in your case, social media strategy, or in my case, climate innovation, or whatever it might be. So it's not so much that you or I maybe have the best ideas or knowledge, though of course we have ideas and knowledge and what have you, and experience. But if we have a network and a reputation around a particular topic, then we become the go-to person around a particular topic. And so I think that idea of access rather than ownership is really, really important in an increasingly connected world. You want to be the person that people pick up the phone to. I remember, again, around the time when I first met with you, I was doing some work with Procter & Gamble, who had a reputation at the time, possibly, probably not anymore, but at the time, for being the most kind of collaborative FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods company in the world. And I remember talking to Unilever, their big competitor, saying who their policies and their strategies were pretty much identical to Procter & Gamble's as far as I could tell, but their reputation was significantly lower in the regard of being a good open innovator and collaborator. And what it meant was, if you were an innovator, entrepreneur, or technologist in that sector, you would go to Procter & Gamble first, because they were the ones who had the reputation for being, the good collaborator in their space. And Unilever were quite annoyed with only ever getting things that Procter & Gamble rejected. So having that reputation, building and nurturing that for being a good collaborator, gives you access to the best people, talent, technology, ideas, whatever it might be, which I think ultimately is more important than owning a small slice of the world. Having that access, nurturing our networks and our reputations throughout them is something that fascinates me, and I think we're still trying to figure out what that means economically and socially. But that's, I think, the work that you do and the work that fascinates me is absolutely in that space. So maybe I'll pause there. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's
I think that's a perfect place to stop. So I want to first of all thank you for your time. Thank you for putting up with my inarticulate questions.
Not at all. No, they've been very articulate.
And as always, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, so I want to thank you for that.
Not at all. Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I really enjoyed it as well.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Low Production High Value Show. Be sure to give us a rating and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Don't forget to check out Volterra at volterradigital.com to learn more about how they can support your social media marketing.